No, we're not going to famous. We're going to talk Gabriel Martinelli, who this year hasn't had. I don't think he's had a poor year. I think he's been perfectly fine. But in terms of last year, that 15-goal season, close enough to breaking the record for most ever goals from a Brazilian in a Premier League campaign. So Arsenal fans saw a lot of promise last year with Gabriel Martinelli. But something's changed this year. George, what has changed?
I definitely think the support that I think the support that he's felt has absolutely changed. There's a couple factors here. One, I don't want to ignore some of the individual mistakes that I think he's made in terms of being a little bit more decisive in the final third. I think that there's definitely some more improvement that he can take individually in terms of where he's completing actions just a bit more with authority. Like, I find too much he's a little bit more timid now, and even with the rule change, which I will discuss right after this, I think it's made him less risk-taking and more risk-averse in a sense, where he is more naturally inclined to recycle, whereas I feel what makes him sharp is, ironically, when he's sharp in the box. And, like those moments of decision are something that we haven't really seen from him too much. Now, to get onto the structure, I definitely think that we've talked about it earlier in the season, but I think that the way that we support our left wing is absolutely not the same to the right. Anybody can see that. And some of that's by design in terms of by looking at the type of winger that you have, where when you've got a straight line runner, you don't want to take away his space. So by introducing more people, you absolutely could, in theory, crowd the spaces that he likes to run into. There's an element of that. But really, what it is for me is it's gone beyond that to the other end of the spectrum, and we just leave him alone. And he's entirely on an island. And you look at most touch maps, there's really no support for him. And there's no dynamic option to provide him a chance to come inside. So he's left forced to be on the touchline and recycle. And so that's where the issue is. There's so many ways that you can introduce a dynamic kind of overload, whether that's from central midfielder, whether that's from fullback, whether that's from even the striker position. There are ways that we've done that. And when we look at last season, what has changed, what is different? Well, there's definitely no longer the same striker overload, because Jesus naturally tends to overload to the left anyways. And Kai Havertz, if he does overload, he prefers the right. So very much there is absolutely a difference in terms of the striker position. And then you start to look at the central midfield position, which has been a really big topic of debate, I would say, for much of this season. Declan Rice, even when he does play, is much more of a carrier, and he won't overlap wide. He won't hold width wide, and so he will carry in an underlap. He won't carry in terms of providing an overlaps. And so then you start to analyze, okay, well, that's not a big problem unless you're talking from a fullback that won't provide that width. And again, you're starting to ask yourself, Zinchenko, Kivior, even at times, even though he's the most adept at it, we've changed the rule slightly to allow him to overlap a bit more. And it resulted in a little bit of increased form for Martinelli. But still, we don't get enough dynamic overlap from the fullback position. So in general, Martinelli, I think, for me, is a player that obviously has immense potential, but he comes alive in central moments. I even look towards the last Bayern game. His best moment is top of the box when he receives and he lashes it across the face of goal in the opening minutes. Like that for me, that jeopardy is when he's in those positions, he comes alive. And if we're going to need somebody to hold with, I think there's other players that we can use to do that. There's other players that we can do that role. And Martinelli's superpower is not holding width, sending in crosses, being creative in terms of a touchline option. He can do it because he's a brilliant player. He's got many skills. But is that his superpower? No, I don't think it is. And so now you either change that by changing Martinelli, changing his role, or you do it by changing things around him. And you make sure that you are providing a way for him to come on the inside. That doesn't mean he's leaving the width alone. And that is really what it comes down to. I think the level of defensive responsibility that we give to both him and Saka isn't right. I've felt for a while that it's great in terms of a humility aspect, but we need to platform our superstars, because I think you see this in every big team. They have a bit more freedom. And so in order to be the best out of possession team in the world, you got to sacrifice that freedom. And I'm fine with doing that concession, but what I'm not fine with is not allowing the team, or at least giving him an option to come inside. If you're going to ask for the defensive responsibility, and you're going to ask for all those things, don't isolate him. Give him a reason to enter on the inside, because he can't do it if you don't have a striker, a fullback, or a central midfielder that is consistently going into those zones to push him inside. And I think that's a problem.
Mm-hmm. there is something to solve there for Alex. And it is a matter of maybe a signing in the summer. But in terms of this season, Martinelli last year showed that in the latter parts, he really comes alive in terms of goal scores and very important goals. And even this year, he scores some very important goals. Nobody that goal gets City at the Emirates Stadium. So is it a slight change that Mikel can make this year that could maybe maximise Martinelli's strengths better?
Yeah, I think George has spoken about the structure brilliantly. So maybe I could talk about the individual. I think Martinelli maybe is a little bit hemmed in by what's going on systemically. I think he's being asked to retain width a little bit too much. The one thing I love about Reece Nelson on the left is he accesses the box from a different angle. Martinelli tends to go sort of up and round, whereas Reece sort of goes into the box straight away. I think also Martinelli hasn't quite got the balance right yet of when to take the shot, when to take the man on, that decision making. I think is still a little bit off. I'd say probably 2 or 3 times a match I go, that wasn't quite the right decision. Whereas Saka, I look at and I'm like, that was the right decision every single time. But I want to talk about that comparison because I think this is a big framing thing before I come back to the question. We're comparing Saka and Martinelli. I think this is kind of Smith Rowe's issue as well, in that what happens is we look at a superstar and someone who has had probably the most linear development of any academy graduate I've ever seen, like in terms of how they progress like that, in terms of how good they are. And we're going, why can't you do that as well? Which I think is unfair. It's like I talk about like comparing Messi to Bojan. It's like you can't do that. I'm not saying Saka's like Messi, but I'm saying it's that when you have that superstar, well maybe when you have that superstar level talent or someone who's really really good, and then you watch the sort of their counterpart and say, well, what's going on with you? I just don't think it's a fair comparison. I think we're seeing the natural undulations of a 22-year-old's career going through and going through development. I think in terms of this season, Arteta can maybe help him a little bit in terms of those. The biggest thing for me is getting him inside in terms of those wide rotations, whether that's pulling Havertz out to the left a little bit more. Havertz actually tends to go out to the right a little bit more, and I wonder if he can help Martinelli out a little bit by going out to the left. I think Zinchenko can be a little bit better on the overlap, but he's not particularly effective out there, so it's one of those things that Kivior can push out there a little bit. But more than anything, I'd maybe just highlight the individual and say I think Martinelli might just have to accept that this season he's a bit of a side character and sort of look ahead to next season and go, okay, where's my next step coming from? And I think it is going to come centrally. I don't think that comes as a centre forward, but how we structure the team, if we want to get the best out of Martinelli, as George was saying, is got to be central.
I thought you were going to say something, my bad. Look, I think the
George,
real question I want to ask
everything someone does before they're about to say something.
That's what I was going to say. I was like,
You went...
I was thinking, but I was like, I want to probe further, because it's like, so here, let's just ask, like, what would you do? What would you like to see in terms of that plan? Like, I know we can do so many different things, and I know that we play so many different ways, and that there's a starting 11 for different things, but how would you, because we have an opportunity to rebuild this side, right? Like, the options are open right now. And I think the two positions that we talk about providing width and dynamism for have been the two most problem positions this season. So evidently the team needs to look for an evolution there, right? Like, it's no doubt Tomiyasu has not provided enough sample at it. Zinchenko hasn't. Kivior hasn't. We've used all three, so it's clearly a position that we're looking at in terms of saying, can Timber do it post-injury? Question marks around that still. In terms of the central midfielder position, we keep talking about the Kai Havertz, the Declan Rice debate. So it's two positions on the side that definitely need surgery. How do you guys see that partnership needing to be created, let's say?
The reason I haven't provided necessarily an option is because I don't think there is one. I think that's in the market. I think for me, I think Zinchenko.
Yeah, like in the market, like how would you do it? How would you build it?
Yeah. So
Arnicky.
I think I'd look for a central midfield option that can rotate out there. That's probably what I'd do. That if I had to stick an option. But this is why I say, this season, I think Martinelli might have to slightly set it out, because I don't think we have an option that can do what he needs structurally. I think we need to look at a central midfielder who can rotate out there, which is why possibly if we're looking at this season, how Mikel can do that, maybe it's asking Havertz, maybe it's looking at Zinchenko, but I don't think he will do that this season. I think that's a central midfield option in the summer who can help him get into lane 4.
I think that's the thing we have to talk about is this season obviously it's going to be hard for Martinelli to get into, but also this idea that once we get a striker that can score 30 goals a season, which fans expect going to happen, and you've got Saka doing 15, 20 on the other side, you're not going to have each player in the forward line getting 20 goals a season. And I think some fans believe that's possible. I don't think it is possible. There will always be one player missing out, I guess, or slightly below. Normally it's a false nine, or it might be one of the wide forwards instead. But in terms of, I guess, the future of Martinelli, and I think this is the big question, Mikel Arteta in January 2023 made a bold move by making a record offer for Mykhailo Mudryk, left winger. We've heard about Pedro Neto and other players like that. Some fans are calling for Rafael Leao. You've got Nico Williams, players like that. My question to you is, if we're in phase 3 right now, do you think Gabriel Martinelli is a part of a phase 5 Arsenal first team? Or Mikel Arteta's first team?
100%. As a winger, I don't think so.
Okay.
I've said, I've said this ever since I saw it. I've got a very big thread that when we signed him, I compared him to Luis Suarez personally. And while he can absolutely play off the left and he can do the role, I think that his ceiling is capped because he comes alive in central areas. And, even when you talk about him as an inside forward, as a winger, guys, we keep beating around the bush. An inside forward is somebody that you want in the box. So even if it's technical and semantic terms, like whether that's at striker or at left wing, you want him in the box. And for us to do that, you either put him up top, or if you're not going to put him up top, then you have to provide somebody to do the role, the Mykhailo Mudryk role, whatever you want to call it. The person holding width has to be there. And I'll be honest, I'll put myself on a mast. I always prefer fullbacks doing that more than I do central midfielders, because for me, a central midfielder must have a quality between the lines that I want centrally. And whenever they go outside to the wings, I feel like it's an option that you can do, but I just feel like you want to get your most technical players in the middle of the park. And that for me is kind of how I view my system in general. For example, I prefer Ben White doing this role than having Martin Odegaard go out there to hold width, even if he was able to. I still would prefer my fullbacks to be wide, and I still would prefer my central midfielders to be inside. I would prefer my wingers, my striker to be closer to goal. That's how I view at least football personally, subjectively. Now, that may not be what Mikel views it as. I think going forward, there's a couple options. If you bought a Musiala, somebody who is a dribbler, let's say, and I'm just using him as you do, but I'm just using him as an example. If you bought like a dribbly type of 8 in that, you're forced to get a fullback for balance that provides that width. Now, if you have somebody that's a little bit more of a passing influence that can drift out wide, then you're able to get an inverted fullback, much like Timber, that likes to come inside like a Jarrell Hato. So there's definitely different ways that you can achieve it, but I still think the balance needs to be correct, where you've got a balance of runners and you've got a balance of passers that are in that pod. The reason the right-hand side works so well is because of that. And despite Bukayo Saka being a ball-to-feed option, and despite Martin Odegaard preferring ball-to-feed, you've still got enough dynamic overlap and strong running power in Ben White that makes that pod work. You take away Ben White, the pod doesn't work. You take away Martin Odegaard, the pod doesn't work. It's because there is a particular chemistry that is involved that we need to replicate on the left, and you can't do it the same way. I think that's what fans are thinking. Like, Gabriel Martinelli is not the same type of winger as Bukayo Saka. You need to do it in a different way. And I do think that we need to start thinking about our winger and our central midfielder complements. We need to start thinking about those things, because if you're talking about a player that likes to run into space, get him a passer, whether that's from fullback or central midfield. Get him somebody to get him the ball. Bukayo will come to you because that's the type of player he is, but he needs somebody to run for him wide, and Ben does that brilliantly. We recognize this on the right, but we don't recognize it on the left, and it is frustrating. I would be frustrated if I was Martinelli as well.
I reckon Mikel has a plan, and I think we'll find out soon enough in his phases, for sure. But if you guys want to hear us talk about Arsenal versus Bayern and a breakdown on that, and Arsenal versus Villa going into the future, there is a full 45-minute podcast available for our Patreon and YouTube members to watch. But as per always, thank you for watching, and we'll see you very soon. Peace.
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 Peace.